British marine artist and illustrator Charles Pears was born in the town of Pontefract in Yorkshire in 1873 and later studied at the nearby East Hardwicke and Pomfret College. He set out on a career as a painter in the early 1890s when he was not yet 20 years old, and it was with his oil paintings of seascapes and generally maritime themes he had the most significant success. He moved to London in the early years of the 20th century, and among other examples of commissions for children's books, in 1907 he created colour illustrations for an edition of Alice in Wonderland, which showed an altogether different aspect of his visual abilities with dexterous use of pen and watercolour washes in the tradition of Arthur Rackham. In 1910 he published the book From the Thames to the Seine, with a series of evocative scenic watercolours and equally impressive line drawings, recording his travels in England and France. And 3 years later, in 1913, he designed his first poster, an atmospheric oil painting of New York at night for the Cunard shipping line. In 1914, Pears undertook his first commission for London Transport, an alphabet of train, omnibus and tram, which light-heartedly promoted travel on the various methods offered by the company, which again demonstrated his facility for gestural line work. And by this point his illustration was increasingly competing with his paintings for his time. But war with Germany began in that year, and he not only served with the Royal Marines, but also found time to work as a war artist. Pears was fortunate enough to survive without injury and in 1918 returned to civilian life to resume his parallel careers. But in the years immediately after the war, he was primarily occupied with painting seascapes again, and it wasn't until the mid-1920s that more examples of his posters began to proliferate. At this time his professional association with London Transport blossomed, and he also began producing a large volume of similar posters promoting British holiday locations for several of the country's rail lines. In the 1930s there were also commissions from the Empire Marketing Board, for whom he produced several posters depicting aspects of life in Britain and its colonies. Not all his travel posters were scenic in nature, and in the 1930s he also began painting altogether more figure-based imagery, featuring crowds of happy holiday makers, and he showed a keen eye for the use of attractive but far from salacious young female characters to draw the viewer in. The majority of his posters were painted naturalistically, which in the 20s and 30s was actually quite unusual in this arena, as most had by now opted for flat-coloured areas through the posterisation process. Even so, every once in a while it seems he also wandered into that territory, although not to any significant degree. Among the many locations he illustrated, the coastal resort of Southend, only some 50 miles from London and so highly popular with its inhabitants, seems to have been the one he returned to more than any other. And this series alone was a telling example of the versatility of his creative and technical abilities. Despite the popularity of his posters, he continued to enjoy success as an artist, and as well as his dramatic seascape paintings, he also had success with his limited edition prints. During the Second World War he worked again as a war artist and produced some stirring paintings of the war at sea, and when it was over in 1945 he carried on as a painter up to his death in 1958 at the age of 85. Henri Mirande was born in Nice on the French Riviera in 1877. I can find no record of a formal art education or anything else about his early life until he moved to Paris around the turn of the century. Mirande lived and worked in the artist colony in Montmartre and initially worked as both an artist and an illustrator. And although he was a talented expressionist painter, he was somewhat perversely reluctant to exhibit his work. But he had no such problems with his illustrations being published, and by the turn of the century his humorous images were appearing regularly in Le Sourire. Soon enough he was working regularly for others, including Le Rire and Fantasio, and there were no less than 7 editions of L'Assiette au Beurre devoted entirely to his work. In 1906 he created some sheet music covers, but in the first 2 decades of the century it was humorous magazine work which forged his reputation. Among his favoured topics was the artist in his studio, and some form of humorous narrative involving life models in various states of undress. And in many ways they neatly defined his broadly good-natured light humour and winning pen and wash style. So throughout the first decade of the century and into the second, he continued to produce more humorous illustration, some of which involved the production of complex and highly absorbing crowd scenes depicting various aspects of French life, frequently with a generous helping of comic sexual activity. His work almost invariably appeared in full colour and combined his light gestural inking with agreeable tonal colour washes. When war with Germany began in 1914, he appeared most frequently in Le Rire Rouge, but even during the worst of this appalling conflict, he continued to produce typically light humour to boost the morale of both the troops and civilians. But for reasons I can't imagine, following the end of the war, he increasingly moved away from comedy, and his work became much darker in tone, more akin to his earlier expressionist paintings. He was regularly creating sombre and frequently disturbing monochrome lithographs and etchings for novels such as 1925's The Kiss of the Leper by François Mauriac. And he continued with this type of work for other equally bleak novels by contemporary writers Pierre Mac-Orlan and Francis Carco. Following these book illustrations, the trail of evidence disappears, so I have no idea how he spent his later life. But Henri Mirande died in 1955 in Paris at the age of 78. Alice Bolam Preston was born in 1888 and lived in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts. In her later teens she attended the Massachusetts school, but as with the others featured in this instalment, I can tell you very little if anything more about her life and circumstances. The earliest examples of her work I could find were for the book Sniffy, Snappy and Velvet Paw by Ruth O. Dyer, published in 1918. Most of the illustrations for this book were created as quite delicate monochrome line and wash, but there were also a couple of pleasing full-colour pages. A year later she published Molly, Waddy and Tony, a story about circus elephants written by Paul Waite, using simpler ink outlines and the application of flat colour. And in 1920 Preston created a large number of particularly pleasing line-only pen and ink drawings for the book 7 Peas in the Pod by Marjorie Bailey. In the same year, the Green Forest Fairy book by Loretta Ellen Brady was also published, and this time around Preston's illustrations were printed as duotone, using a rather garish orange which only served to detract from the innate descriptive quality of her line work. The Little Man with One Shoe, another by Marjorie Bailey, was published in 1921, and this was generously illustrated with a large number of typically well-executed calligraphic pen and ink drawings from Preston, which were mercifully free of studio-added colours. And in the same year she provided a grand total of 2 illustrations, one colour, one monochrome, for Peggy in Her Blue Frock by Eliza Orne White. 1924's The Valley of Colour Days, written by Helen B. Sandwell, featured some particularly delightful watercolour pages, which were successful in demonstrating what her work could be with the addition of colour by the artist herself. And they combined traditional techniques with more modernist simplicity of application with great success. Why more of her book work wasn't published in full colour I don't know, but it seems a great pity that it wasn't. There were also many more of the expected monochrome line drawings in the book, most of which were used as chapter headings throughout. And all of them clearly showed her linear abilities and flair for the creation of woodland fantasy and fairy tale characters. In the later 1920s there's evidence of work created for magazines, including some highly attractive covers for House Beautiful, and one example from an undated copy of Vogue. But unfortunately that's where the trail of her work goes cold, and once more I'm sorry to say that all I can add is that Alice Bolam Preston died in 1958 at the age of 70. Stephen Gooden was born in London in 1892, the son of an art dealer. He studied at the Slade School of Fine Art between 1909 and 1913, and following his graduation he served in the Royal Engineers during World War I. At the end of the war, he set about making a reputation for himself as a master of the use of copper engraving, and it took a few years, but in 1923 he illustrated the particularly obscure ancient Greek book, the Anacreon. Only a year later he embarked on a monumental edition of the Bible for the Nonsuch Press, to be published as a limited edition in several volumes up to 1927. And the combination of decorative motifs and chapter headings cemented his early reputation as Britain's most accomplished copper engraver. In 1929 he created dramatic illustrations for the Brook Kerith, a Syrian story written by George Moore, which had first been published in 1916. Gooden's version was a limited edition of just 500 copies, but served as a showcase which soon led to others. In 1931 he illustrated the Fable de La Fontaine, and for this book he produced a series of absorbing scenic engravings. Despite the book's undoubted graphic qualities, it failed to make much of an impression and sold quite poorly. Creating his work with this technique, combined with a steadfast refusal to work in colour and accept more mainstream commissions, was always going to keep Gooden out of the popular limelight. And in 1933 he returned to the writing of George Moore for the equally obscure Peronnik the Fool. In 1936 he produced what is arguably his greatest and certainly most popular published work, when he returned to the illustration of fables with the moralist stories of the Greek slave Aesop. And unlike the uniform presentation of his illustrations for La Fontaine, for this publication he created a wide variety of illustrations, from simple freestanding close-ups through to more complex scenic work. And he made great use of decorative graphic devices of various kinds in many of the images he produced. 1939 was the year that World War II began, and in that year Gooden produced apocalyptic engravings under the banner The Rider on the Pale Horse, in response to the advent of another global conflict. But he didn't involve himself in propaganda and stuck with the illustration of classics. In 1940 he illustrated Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, with a series of formally composed, quite lightly engraved scenes taken from the text. And in 1945, the year the war ended, he illustrated The Poet's Cat, a collection of verse written by his sister. But despite his relatively low public profile, throughout his career he was in great demand among wealthy organisations and individuals for the creation of engraved ex libris bookplates for their valuable collections and libraries. He also designed banknotes for the Bank of England during his career, the only time his work appeared in colour. And in 1955 Stephen Gooden died at the relatively young age of 63. And although nothing like a household name even in his lifetime, following his death he seems to have been almost completely forgotten. I hope you found something in this collection to your liking, and more of a similar persuasion will be forthcoming next time around.